Let's have a huge applause for the wonderful guests that are coming tonight. Do that really loud. That's what I'm talking about. That's a penguin way, the Dominican way. How many of you are here for the first time? No kidding. You'll have to come back. You've heard all the great things we're going to do the rest of this semester. Hope that you'll join us. My name is Denise Lucy. I'm Executive Director and Professor of Business and Organizational Studies at our Institute for Leadership Studies here in the Borowski School of Business. And we have had a terrific partnership for 18 years with Book Passage. Are any of you Book Passage regular customers? Yes, you are, as all of us are. Well, our program seeks to really bring leadership throughout the curricula and across the disciplines. And our program tonight is one of those ways, a way to bring our community to our campus. Our students and faculty and staff join us, and it's just a tremendous experience. And I want to thank our students who greeted you tonight. Should we thank them too for taking their evening? Thank you so much. And Book Passage, of course, it's a community treasure, and they have programs, of course, in their Corte Madera store and in San Francisco. But they're really a community center, and we're so proud of Bill and Elaine Petruccelli for their vision and commitment to education and to their bringing people together. And of course, you met Karen West, tremendous leader at Book Passage, and we want to thank Karen for being here tonight as well. Could we do that? Thanks. We have two sponsors this evening. Our silver sponsor is Dominican University of California's Women Leadership Philanthropy Council. That's a mouthful. I want you to repeat after me. Women Leadership Philanthropy Council. And we are a group of Dominican and community women who care about advancing women's leadership, and we hope you'll join us. You do not have to be a Dominican alumna or staff or faculty to be among our women's club. We'd love to have you join us. Our goal is to lead, collaborate, and contribute. And we thank you so much for each semester, our Women's Club always sponsoring our program. Thank you, WLPC. And our just superb partner this semester, the County of Marin's Office of Equity, their program called Community at the Table. Their director, Jamelia Jordan, is going to introduce our speaker tonight. I'd like to introduce to you Jamelia Jordan, Marin's Equity Director.
Thank you so much. Thank you. All right. Good evening, everybody, and welcome. How are we doing tonight? Yeah. It's wonderful to be here, to share space and be in community with all of you here this evening. My name is Jamelia Jordan, and I am the County of Marin's Equity Director. And we have a ton of county staff in the house here tonight. Can I get my folks to raise their hands and show some love? Oh, wow. All right. All right. A big focus of ours is on addressing racial and economic disparities here in the county. That's what we do in the Office of Equity. And one way that we do that is through storytelling and through narrative change. And so tonight's conversation is very much aligned with our mission, our focus of creating a county where everyone can thrive and live their best lives. So tonight, everybody, I have the distinct pleasure and honor of introducing our speakers for this evening. Our distinguished speaker tonight, Leila Mottley, is the author of the novel Nightcrawling, an Oprah's book club pick, New York Times bestseller, and the book she will be discussing here today. She started writing when she was 6, so it was a calling, everybody. She started this novel when she was 16, okay? We start them young. She's also the 2018 Oakland Youth Poet Laureate. Can we give her some love on that? So tonight, everyone, Leila will be in conversation with Darwin BondGraham, who is the author of The Writers Come Out at Night and the news editor of the Oakland Side. BondGraham has reported on gun violence for The Guardian and was an enterprise reporter for the East Bay Express. His work has also appeared with ProPublica and other leading national and local outlets. He's also the co-recipient of the George Polk Award for local reporting in 2017. So we have a dynamic conversation lined up for you all. Please help me in welcoming both Leila Mottley and Darwin BondGraham to the stage. Thank you.
Hi.
Hi. Hi, everyone. How are you doing? Good? Happy to be here with you all.
Yeah, it's great to sit down in conversation with you. I've been wanting to actually talk to you since your book came out, having been a reporter who did some of the news reporting at the time about what your book is based on. When I heard someone was writing a fictional account of it, I thought that this was really needed. So just super exciting. Thank you for sitting down tonight.
Thank you.
I've got a bunch of questions of my own, and thank you to the audience members who put cards in with questions, and we'll try to get to some of these before we hit 8 p.m. here. The first thing I wanted to ask you about was when I was reading your book, I just thought about how much love you seem to have put into describing the city of Oakland. You grew up there. Yeah. It's a place I've spent a lot of time and professionally writing about. I just wanted to ask you, like, why did you spend so much time depicting the city of Oakland? Because I feel like a lot of books can just kind of gloss over the place. Why was the place so important for you?
Well, I mean, first of all, I was born and raised in Oakland. I still live in Oakland. It's kind of the basis of my foundation for the world, and so this novel felt fitting to set it there, and in particular because of the time that I was writing it. I graduated high school about a month after I started writing this book, and then I wrote the rest of it during that summer before I left for college. And leaving for college was the first time I'd ever been away from Oakland, and so it was a way of almost saying goodbye and kind of memorializing the city. Because I think one thing I've learned growing up in Oakland, especially in this time period, is that every time you go back, it changes, and it's constantly fleeting, and so you kind of have to grab it and capture it if you ever want to remember what it was.
So that I mean, I think you might be alluding to this there in your answer, but that reminds me of that famous Gertrude Stein quote, which is frequently misquoted, which is, Oakland is a place where there is no there. And I think people use that quote in the 80s and the 90s and the 70s maybe even to say that Oakland was like a non-place, like it was in the shadow of San Francisco. It wasn't Silicon Valley. It was just this kind of nowhere place. Yeah. It's definitely not a nowhere place in your novel. It's a place of national import, right?
Yeah, and I think it's interesting that you bring that up too, because Tommy Orange responded directly to that quote in his novel, They're There, and that is one of the only books that I've read, or really pieces of media I've ever seen that like captures Oakland in a way that felt familiar to me. And still at the same time, like Oakland exists in multitudes, and so every single place that you are, the way, like the people you're around, a block can change the whole world of Oakland. And so it was important to me that I could capture my version of Oakland and kind of give it a place. I think especially because so many of the stories of Oakland that we get and that are visible and present in the media are stories of men in Oakland, when actually written by people from Oakland. And then also the vision that we get of Oakland from outsiders is so often a place of violence and crime and kind of a single note, or on the flip side, a up-and-coming place that you should move to because it's getting hot. And I think for me, like growing up with those being the only two narratives of the place that like I called home, it ended up making me feel like I was kind of floating in some ways, because my world as it existed was never recognized by kind of the mainstream world and culture, and when that happens, I mean, that's how we talk about, you know, what visibility means and what it means to be erased, and especially as Oakland changes, I think it means it's even more important that these kind of stories are told.
Are there other places in Oakland right now that have disappeared within your life that you miss immensely?
Absolutely. I mean, every street in Oakland looks different than it did 5 years ago. And that's a rapid amount
like
of
gentra
change.
fences and the
I mean, my partner and I sometimes talk about like the gentrification font. And so if you look at like the like numbers of any building, you can tell who bought it and who moved in just by the font.
Is it like a, what is the name of the font?
I don't know what the name of the font is. You know
Sharp,
what it
sort
looks
of
like. I know
modern-looking
you all
letters.
know what
Yeah,
it looks
yeah.
like.
No, I know what it looks like.
Yeah.
Interesting. You mentioned Tommy Orange's book, fantastic book. And there have been a number of other novels recently where Oakland is the setting, and there have been some really high-profile films. Boots Riley's really brilliant.
Yeah.
Sorry to Bother You, the Blind Spotting series, the Black Panther films, right? Oakland seems to be having a moment in literature. It's become this place of like global importance. Like, what is going on with Oakland?
I mean, I think in some ways that has always been true. You can look back decades and see that Oakland has been kind of 10 steps ahead. And so if you look at, I mean, the Black Panthers are kind of the meta version of it, right? Where we see this massive undertaking that like Oakland started and has continually been brought up in media, often leaving like Oakland as a place and as kind of intrinsic to how that was possible out of it, but definitely that has kind of put Oakland on the map. And then I think in the past 5 years we've seen, even 10 years, we've seen so much more art about Oakland, and I think part of that is when we feel like we're losing something, we grip onto it and we express it, and art is kind of one of the biggest ways that we do that. It stakes a claim in some ways, and then I also think, in contrast to that, like Oakland has had these like ups and downs, and depending on how the media views it at any one time. And I think that Sorry to Bother You and Blind Spotting kind of ended up building on each other, and that creates more space for more stories like that to end up in the world.
Yeah, like different kind of stories. So I want to ask you about your Oakland. You grew up there, you're very familiar with the city. Yeah. Can you talk about some of the geography? Like, for example, in your book, why did you situate the apartment and the pool, which seems to be sort of dripping with symbolism, right, about people's lives and drowning and control? Why did you put it on High Street? Because I used to live right near High Street, and I walk up and down that street a lot, and you know, I've got fun. You know, I feel it's sort of like in a psycho-emotional space for me. I'm just
Well, I grew up also right off High Street, and so it was kind of the locus of to get anywhere, I would go on High Street, and again, I wrote this book when I was 16 and 17, and so at the time, I would bike every morning up High Street to Fruitvale, and I would take Bart to school, and then I would come home the same way. And so it kind of became my locus of the city, and because of that, it felt like it was necessary for me to like set it in the place that felt most like home to me. But I also think High Street's interesting because in kind of the Oakland lore that we get, it kind of doesn't have a place. And so, you know, we see Fruitvale and West Oakland and the lake and Deep East all as like their distinct worlds. And High Street has its own, but is often left out, I think, partly because it's a place of transit. and so you take High Street to get somewhere else. But also in my experience, that sense of like always getting somewhere else, that's some of the time that I've like met so much of like my kin is walking down the street, and my dad would call out to like anybody, and all of a sudden like we'd be going over to their house, and that's like how family developed for me. And so I wanted to kind of set this book in a way that we can see how that has happened for Kiara and for the other characters.
Yeah, I appreciated how in your book you actually talk about the characters like taking the bus and just like the mundane, like, you know, traveling somewhere and getting around. And I think like for a lot of people, you know, getting from A to B is just hopping in a car and driving, but it's a totally different experience depending on who you are, where you live, what your race is, what your class is.
Yeah, it absolutely is. And my dad doesn't drive, and so a lot of my childhood was spent in the like long period of time between getting one place to another. Like that was the day, was getting somewhere. And so I think it changes everything about your viewpoint of the world. And the bus and BART are like such stamps, like places where I have found myself kind of in the center of Oakland the most. And as a writer, like I pick up so much from just, you know, sitting on the bus, and I also wrote a lot of this on the bus. And so for me, it was like almost a way to have the book parallel the way in which it was written.
Like you literally would crack open a notebook and handwrite, or...
Yeah, on the way to work and, home.
Yeah. So your book, of course, your book is, you know, it's not just set in a place, but it's about people, it's about their lives, it's about something really tragic in some ways. It's about human trafficking. What was your awareness of the problem of human trafficking in Oakland as you were growing up? When did you become aware of how intense an issue this was?
I don't think I can pinpoint like one moment of awareness. I think when you're a young black girl living in any city really, but in Oakland, you become aware with it as you become aware that you are a person and that you have a body and that you exist in this huge world. And so I think I became aware that that there was always going to be kind of like a target on me and the people I loved just by like existing. And I think that in particular, we're talking about the 2015-2016 case of Celeste Guap, who was sexually exploited by different Bay Area police officers. And when that came out, I was like maybe 13 or 14, and I remember not being shocked in any way, more being shocked by the fact that it was ever out in that public of a way, because I had learned that these are the stories that like we don't talk about, but that are very much real for so many of us. And I still don't know a young woman or girl of color who has not experienced some form of sexual harassment or abuse. And so like growing up with that as my like normalcy, but also the silence as kind of part of that, the case brought up kind of this idea of like how do we think about what stories get told and what ways do they get told, and particularly stories of sexual violence, which we feel very uncomfortable about as a culture. And when I was kind of watching all of it happen, reading all of the media, and you know there were protests and there were vigils and all of these things in the city, I remember being really kind of latching onto the way that it was talked about and feeling kind of enraged by how even in an instance where it is supposed to be about this girl and you know kind of the residual impact and stories of other young women and girls that we don't hear about, it still became about the men who abused her and the police department as a whole, and very little of the story was actually about what does it mean not only for her, but for so many of us who, you know, don't have anyone to report to, who, like, if the story doesn't get leaked, then it's not ever going to get told, and who, after it gets leaked or in the face of it being public, that we also still see the complete neglect of accountability.
Yeah, there wasn't a lot of accountability that happened, right, in the actual case.
Right. Yeah, and like both when we're talking about it in like in the justice system, but also I think communally, there was very little sense of the way that we're all culpable for how this happens.
Yeah, and things haven't changed that much in Oakland, right? Human trafficking is still present every day. You can drive down International Boulevard at almost any time of day, and you see people out there being sold, right?
I think it's also important to make the distinction, recognizing that it's a blurry distinction between sex work and sex trafficking, because in so many ways, sex work in the sex industry is criminalized and villainized, and so it's important for us to also like recognize the ways in which sex workers are attempting to survive and to do their jobs, and how so much of what makes that hard and in some ways impossible to do while remaining safe is the criminalization of it, and not actually the work itself.
Yeah, that comes across in your novel because initially the main character, Kiara, right, she sort of stumbles into this fact that like sex work could be a means of making money to support her brother, to pay the rent, to support the child next door, the next door neighbor who's been essentially abandoned. And she stumbles into this, and she's like earning money, and it's sort of possibly empowering at first. And then, of course, she brushes up against sort of the side of, you know, the traffickers, the individuals in the community. I think the character's name is Damon, right? Damon. And so there's that scene. And then after, or around the same time, there's the police officers. And the police, so the police are able to exploit her precisely because her body sex work has been criminalized.
Yes, absolutely. And I think it's interesting because there's also the added layer that like different forms of sex work come with very different realities. And so for Kiara, when she first enters sex work, I mean, at first it's because she's mistaken as a sex worker and kind of hypersexualized by a man much older than her. And then from that point on, she kind of thinks of it as, could this offer me a different life than she was living? And then she ends up kind of meeting these other sex workers who all have pimps, and kind of being introduced to that form of sex work. Street sex work is very different from other forms of sex work, and there are realities about safety that she has to learn that end up, you know, kind of putting her in direct contact with police officers who in this story are the traffickers. Yeah,
and literally you have that scene where the police then bust the house of the sex traffickers who live within the community, and sort of like the individuals involved in committing acts of state violence against the community go in and bust the people who are doing the very same thing that some of them end up doing. Can you talk about your research process for this book? I mean, it sounds like initially you were reading the news and you were just shocked, but also not shocked.
Yeah, I mean, this book didn't start with the case at all. It started with I was 16, and I wanted to write a novel that was from the perspective of a teenage black girl, with kind of the ability for her to be respected, and for her voice to be kind of alive and complex and nuanced, and for her to be like allowed the ability to be vulnerable, for the story to be about the ways that we don't see Black girls and women as vulnerable people. And so it all started kind of there with Kiara and with her voice, and then I think kind of through an amalgamation of different things, I kind of ended up thinking about, you know, how do I show the vulnerability of Black girls and Black women in a way that that has both like a micro sense of weight and also a macro understanding of like the gravity of this, and the ways that we like as a society and as a country continue to participate in neglecting the realities of Black girls and Black women as people in need of protection, which ties very closely into the idea of what happens when the people we're told are supposed to protect us are actually the ones actively harming us, and how is that indicative of the other ways that we as a culture leave Black women alone and isolated, and kind of left to bear the weight of kind of care for this world and care for so many of us, and also at the same time not having our own needs cared for. And
you, in researching the book, you read a lot of the news accounts. Mm-hmm. You also had a sex worker and someone who had experienced exploitation read the copy.
Yeah, I mean, I did a lot of research to begin with to kind of allow myself to get grounded in the idea of like, where is she in time and space, and how does sex work function for Kiara, and then also bringing some of the inspiration from the case, the true case in the Bay Area, as well as other cases of police sexual violence. I did a lot of research. There is very little about police sexual violence, for obvious reasons, and so one of the cases that I spent a lot of time researching was the Daniel Holtzclaw case in Oklahoma, and he raped 13 Black women and girls. I think most of them were underage, and so that's like one of the only public cases of this, which left it and then the Bay Area cases as kind of two of the only ones to draw kind of the actual practical implications from. And then from there, I kind of let fiction take over, and I wrote the first draft of the book, and then in revisions, I did kind of layered research on top of that, and thought about the ways that I wanted to make like intentional choices about what to pull from reality and what was Kiara's alone.
Well, let's talk more about that, because so yeah, I mean, I was a reporter at the East Bay Express in 2015. It was October, actually, and I got a phone call from a source who worked in the city, and they said, "Hey, did you hear about this police officer who committed suicide?" And I said, "No, when did that happen?" And they said, "September." So it was very recent, and then I started calling around and looking into it, and that was the officer who committed suicide in Oakland and left the suicide note that said, you know, these officers have been exploiting this girl. The note claimed that he hadn't. Anyways, I got this call, and so then I started chasing down that story and all these, trying to put the facts together. I feel like now we know pretty much most of what happened in the actual case. The city was forced to hand over a bunch of like internal affairs records, statements. Celeste Guap herself has, given interviews and made statements about it. But there's a way in which what really happened doesn't really tell the full story. And so when I was reading your book, I kind of felt like, fiction has a power to actually tell truths in a way that you can't quite get to with the real story. So I'm just curious, like as someone who's written, a fictional account of this, but you researched the real account, like why, like where and why and how did you make those decisions about where to sort of cut off the reality and bring in, you know, the make-believe in order to tell the more real story, as it were?
I mean, I think it's interesting to even think about what we heard publicly as the real story, right? Because the archive is so limited when it doesn't come from the mouth of the person who actually experienced it. And so I think in some ways we don't have the real story. I think in some ways we never will, because if we think of the story as only about the police officers and exactly, you know, all of the like practical things about what happened, we neglect to understand that like the real story is the undercurrent of why and what that meant for those officers and their psyches and hers, and the ways in which that is reflective of how we, you know, experience power and kind of what sexual violence is, because I think there's often a misconception that sexual violence is purely about sex, and I think in many ways it is about control, and it is about the ways that we attempt to have kind of a claim on how we want to view ourselves and how we want others to view us. And I think in the case of police sexual violence, so much of it ties back into the idea that when we have power, we kind of are constantly grasping for more. And so I think when we're talking about the real story, so much of what I wanted to kind of do in this story was think about how to have a whole life represented and not just a headline, because I think a headline, an article, a clip of an interview on the news is all kind of veiled by our own biases and by the idea of performance and what we feel we're allowed to say and aren't. And so this book is kind of a representation of a young girl, and to be clear, they're very different characters. The real woman is, you know, entirely entitled to her own story, and I think part of what I wanted to do was think about this, especially through the lens of Blackness, and how does that change it, and how do we think about the way that this kind of thing does not end for a victim to continually experience the ways in which the state attempts to have control over her, over us, over our bodies, goes beyond this one instance, right? And we see it through the lens of the rest of her family too, in that all of the men around her in some way kind of try to stake their claim and own her in some way. And I think that is part of what we learn in a very gendered culture. And so when I was thinking about the research and the separation between this true case and this narrative, it was important to me that it became something of its own and did something that, like, we are never going to get from the media, because the media is only one very subjective way of seeing a true event, right? And so I think in some ways there is no claim to truth. And so for fiction to kind of take its own place in kind of assembling the rest of the archive that we don't get, and that we can never really have, is one thing that I think about in kind of all of my work, and particularly in this case where, you know, a lot of the media around it was lacking in so many ways.
I want to hear your media critique in a minute here, but I think that because I have my own media, as someone who is in the media and was sort of at the center of this horrific case as it unfolded, I have my own critique of like my own behavior and but especially the behavior of some of the like televised news and other stuff that was happening at the time. But before we get to that, I feel like it's worth just pausing and diving a little bit deeper into one conscious choice you made about fictionalizing the account. As you said, Celeste Guap, the young woman who called herself Celeste Guap, Latina, born and raised in Richmond, but you chose to make the protagonist of this novel a young African-American girl, woman. We know that all women of color are more susceptible to sex trafficking, exploitation, to all of the pressures that are put onto their lives that can lead to those kinds of things, those kinds of harms, right? Indigenous women, others. But we know that in Oakland, black women are especially vulnerable and victimized at much higher rates. But beyond that, were there other reasons why you felt like this had to be a story about a young black woman?
I mean, beyond the fact that I am one, I think...
That's good.
I think for me, it also tied very directly into the discourse around police violence that has become much more mainstream, though, of course, it has existed since the inception of police, which is centuries. And so it was important to me that this kind of discussion around where do black women and girls fit into our conversations around police brutality, that this book kind of contribute to that conversation, because I found myself very frustrated during both the 2015 uprisings and the 2020 ones, which were after I wrote the book, but I was still in...
Right, because there's two phases, right? There's the 2014-15
which
phases.
Was this huge...
After Trayvon Martin.
After Trayvon Martin, exactly.
Yeah, and then there's the George Floyd uprisings. Yeah.
Which are two separate but kind of like building uprisings that had their own arc, but the thing that was consistent throughout is that even, well, one, black women are, the vast majority of organizers in Black Lives Matter, Say Her Name. I mean, so many of organizations who really were doing the primary organizing around police brutality and looking at reform and abolition. And so it's important to note that black women have always been the organizers and kind of forefront of that. And even with black women being the organizers, there's a way that that it has been continually co-opted and the channel kind of switched from any inclusion of black women and black girls to kind of an intentional neglect. And I think that there was one instance that happens at every protest I've ever been to for Black Lives Matter, and it's the Say Her Name chant, right? And so Say Her Name was founded by Kimberly Crenshaw. It started as just a hashtag, but was specifically to recognize black women who had been victims of police brutality.
Because Breonna Taylor's name wasn't being called out as much, even though she died, a couple months before George Floyd, in a sense.
Yeah, same conversation. And I mean, Sandra Bland was kind of the inception of Say Her Name. And so if you go to a Black Lives Matter protest, you'll often hear whoever has the megaphone will say her name, and then you'll have a name that you're supposed to call back in response. And every single time that would change from say her name to say his name after maybe 2 minutes.
Because people simply didn't know enough names, even though there are
because people simply didn't know, but also I think because we feel uncomfortable thinking about police violence in terms of black women because black women have been positioned to be mourners and protectors and supporters of black men, and that narrative upholds the system that we have that puts black women into a caretaker role. If black women are targets of violence, then how can they also be, cooking our dinner? And then on top of that, there is the idea that we are uncomfortable with recognizing sexual violence as a form of police violence, because I mean, then we have to have conversations about how we, and Black men in particular, learn sexual violence as a method of control and like self-affirmation, and then that ends up meaning that we have to kind of confront ourselves, and there's a whole cultural kind of shift that would need to happen in order to just recognize that Black women are harmed in this very specific way. And so I think because of all of that, we end up kind of shying away consistently from including Black women and girls in kind of the center of what we're talking about when we say police violence, right? And Black women kind of exist only on the margins of that, even though we are the creators of these movements in the first place. And so I think a lot of what I hoped to do in this novel is kind of bring us back to the idea that, like, without even really consciously thinking about it, we consistently leave out a gigantic portion of people harmed by police brutality, and by doing that, like, we don't even have accurate data, you know, because there is no reporting police sexual violence to anyone but police themselves, and because that's one of the primary forms of misconduct, it means we're losing a large percentage of the conversation that needs to be had about police brutality.
I feel like you make a lot of those points in your book, and it does come across really clearly, and it's just, in reading it, it's visceral, it's obvious how all of this violence is changing the characters' lives, especially the Black women in the novel. Even the arrest of Kiara's brother, for example, that obviously is going to have a huge impact on her life. And so there's just a lot of trauma tied up in it. And I maybe I'm overly optimistic here, and maybe but you know, I feel like books like this are changing the public awareness around this. Maybe not enough people are reading this type of literature or seeing these types of films, right? But do you feel like what you're talking about in terms of Black women being made invisible, or being made less visible, or just being marginalized in these conversations around state violence, do you feel like that's changing, or?
Not yet. I think we have a lot more work to do. I think art and even conversation only goes so far, right? And I think that we end up absolving ourselves of responsibility if we believe that, like, reading a book is enough, or writing a book is enough.
Or if people can even read your book. I mean, has your book been banned anywhere yet? We're living in this weird moment where, like,
I don't know if it's had time to be banned.
I wouldn't be surprised.
We'll see.
It's so powerful and good.
Yeah,
and the
sure.
subject matter, I'm sure it really frightens people who feel their privilege being threatened. So I wouldn't, yeah.
Yeah, and I think, like, getting comfortable with discomfort is, like, the first step that we take towards looking at what it would mean to change this kind of thing. But you know, I kind of like to think of literature and art in general as, like, one leg of what it takes to, like, make a movement walk. And I think that if we forget the other leg of that, which is, like, showing up, and that means, like, showing up in policy, in protest, in kind of our individual lives, that is what actually propels us into a different function of this world, and art is what plants the seed for even, like, getting up and doing that. And so I think when I think of this book, I mean, I think it's incredibly important, especially for many of us who have just never had this thought, because this is not in this kind of narrative is not in our public imagination, right? And that is part of what art does. Is it changes our collective imagination and our ability to think about what it would mean to live in a world where this couldn't happen.
Let's talk about the media really quick, or take as much time as you want. So yeah, when this when the real case came to light in early 2016, it became like this feeding frenzy of media. You had like CNN and Fox and all these national networks swooping into Oakland, and it became a national story very quickly. And again, the young woman at the center of it, Celeste Guap, her face was put all over TV. But as you said, her story really wasn't told. Right? There was no way it was going to be told. And there was a lot of focus on the police department and the city of Oakland being this sort of like basket case police department and city administration. There was a way in which Celeste Guap was exploited by everyone, right? Like, she experienced exploitation at the hands of family members, and then at the hands of police officers, and then at the hands of, Johns or clients of hers, and then at the hands of the media, which kind of came in to sort of feed off of this salacious, phenomenal story that had been created. Then the attorneys kind of swooped in. There were several attorneys who had tried to get her to sign these very sketchy contracts. And in the end, what did she really get? She was just sort of left alone, exploited by almost everyone around her, including the media. I just want to hear your critique a little bit more of the media's role, because there are some limitations to what reporters were doing, right? Which I think you got at, like the archive that's created that they can refer to as factual is predominantly controlled by authorities like the police, and it's hard to get other kinds of factual reference points to go around. But like, what could the media do? Because this isn't just gonna happen again, right? We're literally living through new police scandals all the time. What should the media be doing differently?
That's a big one. I think you're right. It became an Oakland story. It became a Bay Area story, and by doing that, we feed into the bad apple narrative that the problem is individual police officers and not policing, and the institution that creates not only the possibility for this to happen, but the conditions for it to go almost entirely to disappear, really, because the media comes in waves, right? And so we saw the wave, and then
the news cycle comes.
The news cycle, right? And so with the news cycle, there was very much like a talk about Oakland and the police department, and even though there were other Bay Area police officers, so many of them were from Oakland, and so there was this conversation in the media that happened about the Oakland Police Department and kind of the institutional problems within the Oakland Police Department that could be reformed into doing better. And I think that narrative very much ended up shifting so much of what we even look to for like justice and what it looks like for there to be consequences. Because in my book, the consequence was never going to be judicial, because this is not something that happens. There are no indictments. There were no convictions. I think there were a couple people who were charged, and then charges were dropped. And
quietly, yeah.
Yeah, and that is the reality that we know. And to have that in conjunction with the media's lack of kind of responsibility over what narrative that they were pushing too, which became a narrative of what does this mean for the police department? Is this going to damage the relationship between the police department and the community? What are the repercussions for these officers, and then for the police chief and the structure of the police department, and then for the mayor? And it became a story that we could so easily forget what it was actually about, because it could have been about, really anything, with the way that it was talked about, which was entirely centered on the structure of the police department, and not kind of the ways in which this institution creates conditions where this is not only possible but normalized. And I think we can be completely sure that this is happening right now. Because there was no consequence, and that tells us a lot about what we will accept, especially when there was also no communal consequence. And I think in many ways that's the role that the media is supposed to have, is like, even when the institution, when the state wants to forget, that the media is supposed to serve the role of at least providing the complete story as far as it ever can be provided. And I think in many ways the media failed to do that.
Yeah, I think I agree with you on that. I think the media failed in a lot of ways around telling that story, and I think that one of the biggest ways they failed is what you're saying about they couldn't tell the story of the young woman, and so fiction was a powerful way to tell it. Hopefully next time there's a different way for media to cover these things. Here's the next time on this card right here. Oh.
Can I ask you a question first?
Absolutely.
If there was a next time, do you think the ways that you reported it would change?
That's a great question. So my newspaper, the East Bay Express, the reason we focused on the police and not the young woman was because we were initially trying to protect her identity. Her name is publicly known. I'm not going to say it here. You can look it up easily if you want to. But it wasn't publicly known initially. It was known only within the police department. It was confidential. And my writing partner, Ollie Winston, and I were committed to the idea of trying to keep her as anonymous as possible because we felt that we wanted to make the story about the accountability for the police. We wanted to get indictments because we were disgusted with what these officers had done in abusing their authority. So we went hard after these particular police officers. We stayed up late at night calling their cell phones, trying to catch them out in their lies, things like that. Unfortunately, there was a moment when Celeste Guap was exiting the Oakland Police Department headquarters building after conducting an interview with the Internal Affairs Department. And a police officer called up a TV news reporter and told them that, and the TV news reporter, in their quest to get the big scoop, ran down there, put her on camera, and started asking her questions. And from then on, it was obvious who this individual was. And it was just sort of that media frenzy to get the big scoop, to get the big story. I think I would have done a number of things differently myself. I'm proud of a lot of the decisions we made about our coverage, but I think we could have stood to actually be more reflective about the meta story itself, step back, look at the media, and do more commentary and do more analysis about the media as it was covering the incident in real time. And we didn't do that. We were just so focused on actually trying to figure out what the police officers had done and trying to get then District Attorney Nancy O'Malley to file charges against some of them. Some of them did get charged. Most of them got away scot-free. There are still police officers in the Oakland Police Department who sexually exploited that girl. They wear a badge and a gun today, and they drive around Oakland, and it's really disturbing. Bad apples, question from the audience is a good one. The Antioch Police Department has been in the news for racism. People are aware of this. Text messages, vile stuff. Do you feel Bay Area police will become a trusted, caring group? Can they? What would it take?
What would it take? I mean, I am an advocate of abolition as kind of the only way to change the policing system as we see it. I mean, the policing system does not need to exist, and we have learned it as a culture out of fear, really, that it is a necessity to our safety, when in fact very rarely do police actually save us from anything, right? Police in so many ways are a response to harm that has already happened, and even in those instances fail to really ever do much about it beyond pushing more people back into a carceral system that really just harms Black and brown people. And so I think where I stand, I don't think there's a way in which we can escape the idea of police abusing their power, because it is the institution that is set up for that, right? You can't give individuals a disproportionate amount of control over other people's lives and not expect them to in some way abuse it. And so I think many of us just need to get more comfortable with what does it look like for us to not rely on this system to make us feel safe, because it's not actually making us safe. It's providing us the illusion of protection, and I get it. I think that we want to feel like we have something to fall back on, and like we are going to be protected. And I think we have to face the reality that that's actually not what's happening. And for those of us that have not had to come into contact with policing, I think it means there is even more of a reason to think about all of the other people who have to come into contact with police on a regular basis, and is the harm that is done worth the like rare time that anything good happens?
How will you safeguard the opportunity of being average? I think this person means, well, when your book gets hyped by Oprah, your life probably gets turned upside down. Can you just be a normal person walking around your hometown now, or are you just like swarmed by people? Or
it's not a swarm most days.
Lots of selfies, or like?
Yes, actually.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I go to the grocery store and I go get a coffee, and I often get stopped, but it's mostly out of like love and kind of a sense of communal respect for repping Oakland, and like that's great. I don't mind that at all. I think I preserve normalcy in my own life, and so it doesn't really bother me as much when, you know, I'm working and I don't feel quite normal, because I get to go home and my life is virtually the same as it was, you know, the month before the book came out.
Do you have any advice for those trying to share their stories, especially young women? I mean, what's one piece of advice you would share with young women who are trying to share a story?
Get good at learning that being respectable is not the most important thing. I think we learn as young girls that so much of our value is in being tolerated and tolerable. And when we learn that from such a young age, I mean, it's kind of impossible to separate ourselves from the idea that, like, to be successful, to be valuable, to be loved, you have to be agreeable. And telling any story that has not been told before automatically puts you in a position where some people are not going to respect you as a product of them being uncomfortable with your ability to step beyond what you were taught and the role that you were taught to fit in. And so, I mean, get real comfortable being uncomfortable.
I'm told we're stopping at 8, but do people mind if I keep reading questions? Mm-hmm. Thank you. Am I allowed to ask you this? This person says, I love this book. We read it for our book club. What's your next novel?
You're allowed to ask. I might not answer.
You want to be cryptic about it, maybe? Or just give us some hints?
I have another novel. It's not set in Oakland. It's not set in California. And it will be out in a little over a year, probably. Yeah.
Interesting.
But I have a poetry collection that comes out next summer, too. So.
Cool. How did you find your passion for writing?
I've been writing since I learned how, literally. And so I think I just naturally gravitated towards it, partially, I think, because I grew up in a house where like my mom liked to read, and my dad he would go to work and then he'd come home at like 10 p.m. and he'd start typing, and so I would like know it was time for bed because his like keyboard would start clicking.
Is it computer keyboard, old school typewriter keyboard?
Yeah, like old keyboard, like
keyboard.
old
that really clickety
computer,
clack.
like the big computer. Yeah. And
what do you write on?
I write on like a normal computer.
like a MacBook?
I have a MacBook now. I started on a Chromebook.
Wow.
I mean, I guess I started by hand, and that's still my favorite is writing longhand. But I won't show anyone it because I have really bad handwriting. And so I kind of learned the idea of writing as like something you do out of like love and passion. Because as much as my dad tried, he would like keep putting his plays out and like trying to get producers to show them on off Broadway and all of that, and no matter how many no's came back, he kept doing it. And I think like learning that and watching that really taught me writing as like not a chore, which I think is what so many of us learn it as in school. And so I think a lot of my love for writing came from just like never viewing it as something I had to do. And then I think slowly I just started doing like more creative writing, and I started with poetry, and then I started short stories, and then I wrote my first novel when I was 14, and I kind of just fell in love with it.
What are you reading right now?
I'm finishing Solito by Javier Zamora, who is from San Rafael. He grew up here, so.
My book club read your book. It was a wonderful book club book, as it created a lot of discussion. I'm sure you've heard this from many a book club now. What is the status of the Oakland police today?
The status? They're still doing it. They're, a business as usual, I think. It was a short-lived upheaval. And I remember, there were, how many police chief turnovers in the course? Like 3 in 9 days, something like that?
Yeah, 3 in a week or whatever.
Yeah. And there was this frenzy about, is the Oakland Police Department over? Is it collapsing?
Right.
And that did not happen. And I think that we continue to see, Oakland police feel as righteous as ever. And I think a lot of that comes from kind of the history of Oakland, and particularly black people in Oakland, resisting policing. And so we have a very robust police force as a counter to that, because they're scared. And the idea that, they might lose their power, I think, terrifies them. But that just, means they reinforce it over and over again. And I think that happened especially in 2020.
Yeah. Well, we're out of questions. So
right.
I want to thank you for this conversation.
Thank you
and
so much.
Can everyone thank
you all.
Leila for sharing your talent with the world?
I think they're coming up.
I want to thank you guys so much. I think you have us all revved up. I like your ideas of social change. I like the 2 legs. I'm taking away the 2 legs. Art on one hand and getting out there, the action on the other. And you're just a marvelous storyteller. It's just marvelous. And you were amazing at drawing her out. Thank you so much, both of you.
Thank you.
And as she said, she's reading Solito. Which, are you liking it?
Yeah, so I met Javier a couple months ago, and he's an incredible person and
he's
a beautiful
extraordinary.
writer.
And he's going to come here and be in conversation with Isabel Allende.
Oh, wow.
I'll be there.
Okay, good. I hope to see you back here for that.